when FBI agent Stephanie Carter is wrongfully arrested by a racist cop during a critical undercover mission, her world turns upside down. As her identity is revealed, the cop's world crumbles, facing public and personal consequences. But as Stephanie's career rebounds, can Officer Wells truly seek redemption, or is this too deep a wound to heal? The final confrontation between the two reveals far more than either of them expected. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. It was a balmy evening, the kind where the world seemed to exhale in relief as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets. Stephanie Carter sat behind the wheel of her nondescript sedan, hands loosely gripping the steering wheel, her eyes trained on the black SUV a few cars ahead. Her pulse was steady, her mind focused. She'd been tailing this suspect for weeks, quietly, carefully. Tonight felt different, though. There was an unease in the air, as if something was about to go wrong. She had been briefed earlier that morning. Follow the man, observe his behavior, but don't get too close. He was a slippery one, connected to a large-scale financial fraud ring that the Bureau had been tracking for months. Stephanie, a skilled and dedicated agent, was part of the surveillance team. Her role was critical, yet it was designed to be as low-key as possible. No confrontation, no fireworks, just watch and report. Stephanie wore a casual outfit, jeans, a faded sweatshirt, her hair tied back into a simple ponytail. It wasn't her usual field attire, but blending in was essential for this mission. In this quiet suburb, where the lawns were pristine and the houses all looked the same, someone like her could easily stand out. She knew it. The FBI knew it. But the job had to be done. Suddenly, the SUV slowed down. Her heartbeat quickened. Was the suspect aware of her? Had he noticed something off? She kept her distance, allowing a few more cars to slide between them. It was the kind of tension she thrived on, this delicate balance of staying close enough to observe, but not so close as to be seen. Just as she was settling back into her rhythm, headlights flared behind her, uncomfortably bright. A glance in the rearview mirror showed a police car, its lights flashing. Her stomach sank. "Not now," she muttered under her breath. The last thing she needed was to be pulled over and questioned in the middle of a surveillance operation. She signaled and pulled over, her mind racing. Was it a routine stop? Could the officer have picked up on something unusual about her car or the way she was driving? She'd been careful, methodical even. There was no way she could have drawn attention to herself. She rolled down her window as a figure approached her car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, and his expression one of stern authority. Officer Jacob Wells. He looked like the type who took his job seriously. Maybe too seriously. "License and registration?" he said, his voice sharp and uninviting. His eyes darted over her face, then her car, as though assessing her worthiness to even be sitting there. Stephanie calmly reached into her glove compartment for her registration and pulled her wallet from her bag. "Officer, I'm license and registration," he repeated, louder this time, his tone brooking argument. She sighed internally, but handed him the documents. "Officer, I'm on duty. I'm a federal agent." Wells' eyes narrowed. "A federal agent?" he repeated with heavy sarcasm. "Really?" His gaze swept over her casual attire, the everyday car. Nothing about her screamed law enforcement. He'd heard this kind of story before. It wasn't uncommon for people to try to talk their way out of trouble by claiming to be someone they weren't. Stephanie clenched her jaw. "Yes, FBI. I'm in the middle of an operation, and I need to get back to it. I'm asking you to let me call my supervisor to clear this up." But Wells wasn't listening. His mind had already categorized her as suspicious, another person who didn't belong in this neighborhood. To him, it didn't matter that she was claiming to be a federal agent. What mattered was the color of her skin, the hoodie, the old car. It all fit a narrative that he had seen too many times in his career, or at least that's what he believed. "Step out of the car," he said, his hand moving instinctively toward the holster on his belt. Stephanie's frustration flared, but she knew better than to push back too hard. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know that escalating a situation like this would only make things worse. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the door and stepped out. The cool evening air brushed against her skin, but her focus remained on the officer. "I need to make a call to my supervisor," she said again, her voice steady, even though irritation was bubbling beneath the surface. Wells raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He gestured toward the patrol car. "We'll see about that," hands on the hood. Her eyes widened slightly. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, his tone clipped. "Hands on the hood." Reluctantly, Stephanie complied, feeling the cold metal under her palms as she spread her hands on the hood of her car. Her heart pounded, but not out of fear, out of anger. This was not how things were supposed to go. She had worked too hard, had come too far in her career to be treated like this. As Wells frisked her, his touch rough and impersonal, Stephanie's mind raced. She was missing valuable time. The suspect she had been tailing could be getting away right now, and all because of this officer's blind assumptions. She tried to remind herself to stay calm. This would be over soon. Her team would realize she was off-grid and come looking for her. But that didn't make the humiliation any easier to swallow. Wells stepped back, satisfied that she wasn't carrying any weapons. "Let's go," he said, guiding her toward his patrol car. "We'll sort this out at the station." Stephanie didn't argue. What was the point? She knew the protocol. She knew how these things worked. But as she sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the quiet streets she had been patrolling for weeks, a bitter taste filled her mouth. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was more than that. It was the weight of every unfair assumption, every act of prejudice she had faced throughout her life, crashing down on her all at once. And the worst part? She couldn't even fight back. Not yet. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but her hands were cuffed. She could only guess it was her team, probably wondering where she was. But there was no way she could reach them now. All she could do was wait. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Stephanie couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over. Something told her that the consequences of this encounter were going to ripple far beyond this quiet suburban street. The police station was a stark contrast to the quiet suburban street where Stephanie had been apprehended. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the worn linoleum floors. The dull hum of police radios filled the air, along with the occasional murmur of officers exchanging reports. To Stephanie, the station felt more oppressive than ever before. Officer Wells walked ahead of her, his posture stiff and confident, as if he had just made the biggest bust of his career. The handcuffs on her wrists clinked together lightly as she moved. The metal felt cold against her skin, but it was the injustice of the situation that chilled her even more. She had tried to stay composed during the drive to the station, but her patience was wearing thin. Stephanie glanced around as they passed the open desks of the precinct, where officers typed away at computers or sipped from their coffee mugs. Some of them threw curious glances in her direction. To them, she was just another suspect being processed, nothing more. None of them knew her story. None of them knew the truth. Wells stopped in front of a holding cell and turned to her with a thin, self-satisfied smile. "In here," he said, unlocking the door and motioning her inside. Stephanie stepped into the small, barren room. The cell was as generic as they came. Plain metal bench, gray walls, no windows. The door clanged shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. The sound echoed in the empty space, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she felt trapped. She had no way to call her team, no way to defend herself. All she could do was sit and wait. Her hands were still cuffed behind her back, but she managed to lower herself onto the bench. The metal was cold beneath her, matching the icy knot in her chest. She stared down at her feet, willing herself to remain calm. She couldn't lose her cool now, not when things could still get worse. She had seen too many situations spiral out of control, and she refused to be the one to make it worse. But it was hard. So hard to sit there and do nothing while the clock ticked away. Every minute spent in this cell was another minute her suspect was getting farther away. He could be disappearing right now, slipping through the cracks. And there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. It wasn't just her career that hung in the balance. It was justice. The man she had been tracking was connected to a sprawling network of financial crimes that had ruined lives. People had lost everything because of him. And now he was out there, free, while she was being treated like a common criminal. The injustice gnawed at her, threatening to break through her carefully constructed calm. "Think, Stephanie," she whispered to herself. "Just think." But her thoughts kept circling back to the same question. How had things gone so wrong? Officer Wells, she knew, was the key to all of this. If he had just listened to her, if he had even considered the possibility that she was telling the truth, none of this would be happening. But no, he had looked at her and made a decision in an instant. He had judged her based on the way she looked, the way she dressed, the car she drove. None of her credentials mattered. None of her achievements or experience counted in his eyes. She was black. She was in a neighborhood where he didn't think she belonged, and that was enough for him. Stephanie had dealt with prejudice before. It was a part of life, especially in her line of work, but it had never felt this personal. Not like this. There had always been a way out before, a way to prove herself, to show that she was more than someone's assumptions. But here, in this cell, her voice had been taken from her. She had no badge, no gun, no authority. She was just another woman sitting behind bars, waiting for someone to give her a chance to explain herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt vulnerable. Exposed. Like all the hard work she had done to get where she was, could be undone by a single moment of ignorance. Stephanie looked up at the ceiling, trying to push the anger away, but it kept bubbling to the surface. Her jaw clenched as she thought about Wells and the arrogance in his eyes when he had slapped the cuffs on her. He didn't see her as a person. To him, she was a problem to be handled, a threat to be neutralized. It didn't matter that she had told him she was FBI. He hadn't even bothered to verify it. He had made up his mind the moment he saw her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching her cell. She sat up straighter, her pulse quickening, hoping that it was someone from her team, someone who would finally end this nightmare. But it wasn't Marcus or anyone from the FBI. It was Wells, looking as self-assured as ever. He stood in front of the cell, arms crossed over his chest, his keys dangling from his belt. "You doing okay in there?" he asked, his voice laced with fake concern. Stephanie stared at him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. Wells tilted his head, as if he were studying her. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've seen a lot of people try to lie their way out of trouble. You think you're special? You think that story about being an FBI agent is going to get you out of here?" Stephanie felt her hands ball into fists behind her back. The cuffs dug into her skin, but she didn't care. "I am an FBI agent," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "And when my team gets here, you're going to regret this." Wells chuckled, shaking his head. "I doubt that." He took a step closer to the bars. "See, people like you. People like me?" Stephanie interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She had heard enough. "What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" Wells's smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. "I mean people who think they're above the law. People who think they can flash a fake badge and get out of trouble." Stephanie stared at him, her anger rising again, hotter this time. "You're wrong, and I'm done trying to explain that to you." Wells shrugged, as if it didn't matter to him one way or the other. He turned and started to walk away, but before he left, he threw one final comment over his shoulder. "We'll see about that when your little story falls apart." The door to the holding area closed behind him, and Stephanie was left alone again. The silence in the room was deafening. She let out a slow breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. But the anger wouldn't go away. It sat there, simmering just beneath the surface. Not just at Wells, but at the entire situation. At the world that allowed people like him to have power over people like her. She had worked so hard to get to where she was. She had put in the hours, taken the risks, done everything right. And yet here she was, sitting in a cell, waiting for someone to see her as more than just another suspect. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Her phone was still in Wells's possession, and she had no idea how long it would be before her team realized something had gone wrong. But she trusted them. They would come for her. They had to. For now, all she could do was wait. But as she sat there, she made a silent vow to herself. When this was over, when she was finally free, she would make sure that Wells, and anyone like him, faced the consequences for their actions. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had been judged unfairly, treated as less than human, simply because of the way they looked. And if there was one thing Stephanie Carter believed in, it was justice. And justice, she knew, was coming. The hours ticked by painfully slowly in the small holding cell. The hard metal bench had long since become uncomfortable, the cold of the steel seeping into Stephanie's bones. Every so often she would hear the muffled sounds of activity outside, the faint hum of conversations, footsteps, and the occasional phone ringing. It all felt so distant, like she was trapped in an alternate reality, cut off from the world outside. She had gone over the situation 100 times in her head, replaying every moment from the stop to the arrest. None of it made sense. She had tried to do everything by the book to de-escalate the situation, but Wells had been determined from the start. His prejudice had driven every decision, and now she was paying the price. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a door opening. Footsteps, quick, urgent, were coming down the hall. Stephanie straightened up, her heart racing as the footsteps grew louder. Maybe it was finally someone from her team. Maybe they had figured out what had happened and were here to get her out of this nightmare. The cell door opened with a loud clang, and for a split second, hope surged in her chest. But when she saw Officer Wells standing there, his face as smug as ever, the hope deflated instantly. "Rise and shine," Wells said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Looks like your luck's about to run out." Stephanie stared at him, her jaw clenched. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her composure. Every word out of his mouth seemed designed to provoke her, to make her react. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Before she could respond, another voice rang out from behind Wells, one that sent a wave of relief washing over her. "Jacob, what the hell is going on here?" Officer Wells turned, and for the first time since their encounter, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Stephanie craned her neck to see past him and immediately recognized the figure standing at the doorway, Agent Marcus Reed, her supervisor. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and piercing eyes that were now fixed on Wells with barely restrained fury. Behind him, a few other agents from her team stood, their expressions grim. They had finally arrived. "Marcus," Stephanie said, her voice steady but tight with relief. "Get those cuffs off her right now," Marcus barked at Wells, stepping forward with barely concealed anger. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his presence. Wells hesitated, his usual confidence faltering for the first time. He fumbled with the keys on his belt, clearly trying to process what was happening, but the realization was dawning slowly in his eyes. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. She said she was..." Wells began, stammering as he unlocked the cuffs on Stephanie's wrists. The heavy metal fell away and Stephanie stood rubbing her wrists, her eyes locked on Wells. Marcus turned his icy gaze on Wells, cutting him off mid-sentence. "She told you she was FBI, didn't she?" His voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm that made it clear how angry he truly was. Wells swallowed, his throat bobbing as he searched for the right words. "She was acting suspicious, driving around the neighborhood, and You didn't bother to check her credentials?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "You didn't think it was worth confirming her identity before arresting her?" "I thought..." Wells started, but Marcus wasn't interested in his excuses. "You thought wrong," Marcus snapped. "Stephanie Carter is one of my best agents, and because of your idiotic, prejudiced assumptions, you just jeopardized an entire federal operation." The weight of Marcus's words hit Wells like a punch to the gut. His face went pale, and, for a moment, he looked like a man who had been blindsided by the reality of his actions. He took a step back, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a coherent response. Stephanie watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She had spent the past several hours being treated like a criminal, and now, seeing the dawning realization on Wells' face, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a deep, weary sadness. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. This was about a system that allowed people like Wells to make snap judgments, to abuse their authority without consequences. "Marcus, I'm fine," Stephanie said quietly, stepping forward. She could feel the tension rolling off her team in waves, their anger palpable, but she didn't want things to escalate further. "We need to focus on the mission." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "I know, Steph. But this—" He gestured toward Wells. "This needs to be dealt with." Stephanie nodded. She agreed, but she also knew that the mission had to come first. The suspect they had been following was still out there, and every minute they spent here was another minute he had to slip away. "We'll deal with it. But right now, we need to get back on track. I've been out of contact for hours, and we can't let him get away." Marcus nodded, his face grim. He turned back to Wells, who was still standing there, a thaw's strength, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. "You're lucky we don't have time for this right now. But trust me, this isn't over." Wells opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, Marcus waved him off. "Go. Get out of here before you make things worse." Wells, looking thoroughly chastised, nodded and quickly left the room. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Stephanie and her team in the quiet of the holding area. Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Stephanie exhaled, feeling some of the tension leave her body. "I'm fine," she said. She shook her head, trying to find the right words. "I just need to get back to work." He gave her a knowing nod, his eyes full of understanding. Marcus had been in this business long enough to know that what had happened to Stephanie wasn't just an operational setback. It was personal. But he also knew that right now, the mission had to come first. "All right," he said, "let's get out of here." As they left the station, Stephanie couldn't help but think about the look on Wells's face when Marcus had confronted him. That moment of realization, when the truth had finally sunk in, had been satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. But it wasn't enough. There had to be more. More accountability, more change. Wells was just one officer. But his actions reflected a deeper problem, one that Stephanie had been battling her entire life. As they climbed into the Bureau's SUV, Marcus turned to her from the driver's seat. "We'll make sure he faces consequences, Steph. I promise." Stephanie nodded, appreciating his words, but knowing that promises like that were hard to keep. Accountability was elusive in situations like this. Too many people were willing to turn a blind eye, to brush incidents like this under the rug. She had seen it happen before. But not this time. This time, she would make sure the truth came to light. As the car sped down the highway, her mind shifted back to the mission. They still had work to do, and she wasn't going to let one man's prejudice derail everything she had worked for. The case wasn't over, and neither was the fight for justice. And if there was one thing Stephanie Carter had learned in her career, it was that justice, no matter how delayed, was always worth pursuing. The drive back to headquarters was a silent one, the weight of everything that had transpired hanging thick in the air. Stephanie stared out the window, her mind racing through the events of the day, while Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The sky was a deep purple now, the last remnants of daylight fading as the city slipped into night. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound between them. Stephanie's heart was still pounding, the adrenaline from the ordeal slow to dissipate. The handcuff marks on her wrists had begun to fade, but the sting of what had happened was fresh, as raw as ever. It wasn't just the humiliation, though that had cut deep. It was the principle of it. The fact that despite all of her achievements, all the barriers she had broken through in her career, she was still vulnerable to the same biases, the same assumptions. And worse, the consequences of Wells' actions could have jeopardized an entire federal operation. Marcus glanced over at her, his face etched with concern. "You sure you're okay?" Stephanie nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "I'm fine, just trying to process everything." "I'm furious," Marcus admitted, his voice low but full of tension. "What that guy did, I can't even wrap my head around it. I want to report him, make sure he faces the consequences for this." "He will," Stephanie said quietly. "But we both know this isn't just about him. It's bigger than that." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I know. It's just seeing you like that, knowing what you've gone through, what you've accomplished, it makes me sick. How could he not see it?" Stephanie smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. He didn't want to see it. He saw what he wanted to see. That's how people like him operate. They drove in silence for a few more minutes. the tension between them thick but unspoken. Marcus had always been a strong advocate for Stephanie. He had seen her potential from the start and had fought to ensure she had every opportunity to rise in the bureau. But this was a reminder of the invisible battles she fought every day. Battles that even he, despite his best efforts, couldn't fully shield her from. When they finally reached the office, Stephanie's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a series of missed calls and messages from her team. They had been scrambling to get in touch with her ever since she had gone dark. Relief washed over her as she realized that, despite everything, the case was still salvageable. But it wouldn't be easy. As she and Marcus walked into the briefing room, the other agents stood, their expressions a mixture of concern and urgency. A large screen at the front of the room displayed the latest updates on the case, including the suspect's last known location. Agent Torres, one of Stephanie's closest colleagues, stepped forward. "Steph, thank God you're okay. We've been trying to reach you for hours. What happened?" "It's a long story," Stephanie said, forcing a small smile. "But I'm back now. What's the latest on our suspect?" Torres nodded, pulling up the most recent intel on the screen. "We tracked him to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It looks like he's meeting with some of his associates tonight. We've got a team ready to move in, but we wanted to wait for you before we made any final decisions." Stephanie felt a surge of gratitude for her team. Despite everything, they had waited for her, trusted her judgment. "Good. Let's go over the plan and make sure we're ready. We can't afford any more mistakes." As they huddled around the table, discussing the details of the operation, Stephanie felt herself slipping back into her professional role. The events of earlier in the day still gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on them now. There was work to be done, and she was determined to finish what she had started. Later that night, after the operation was successfully underway, Stephanie found herself sitting alone in the office, the quiet hum of computers and distant chatter of agents a comforting backdrop. The mission had gone off without a hitch. The suspect and several of his associates had been apprehended, and the Bureau had secured critical evidence that would lead to several high-profile indictments. On paper, it was a success. But Stephanie couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside her. The truth was, the events of the day had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just the arrest, it was what it represented. After all these years, after all the progress she thought she had made, one moment of bias had reduced her to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of a man who didn't even know her. The door to the office creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside. He closed the door softly behind him, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to check in," he said, taking a seat across from her. "How are you holding up?" Stephanie shrugged. "I'm fine. We got the job done, didn't we?" Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You know that's not what I'm asking." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know, Marcus. I thought I was past this. I thought if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, things like this wouldn't happen anymore." Marcus frowned, his eyes full of sympathy. "It's not about how hard you work, Steph. You know that. The system is broken. You can be the best agent in the world, but as long as people like Wells are in positions of power, things like this will keep happening." "I know," she said softly. "It's just exhausting. I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen for who I am, not what people think I am. And today, it felt like none of that mattered." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding all too well. "I get it, and I'm not going to pretend like I know what you've been through, but I will say this. You have people in your corner. We see you, Stephanie. We know what you're capable of, and no one can take that away from you." Stephanie smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Marcus." He stood, clapping her on the shoulder gently. "Take the night off. You've earned it. We'll deal with the fallout from today tomorrow." The next day, Stephanie found herself in the Bureau's Internal Affairs office, sitting across from a panel of investigators who had been tasked with looking into the incident with Officer Wells. It was an uncomfortable process, reliving the arrest, going over every detail of what had happened. But Stephanie knew it was necessary. The panel listened intently as she recounted the events, their faces grim but professional. When she finished, one of the investigators, A woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor leaned forward. "Agent Carter, thank you for your testimony. We're going to take this very seriously. Officer Wells will be suspended pending a full investigation, and we'll make sure appropriate action is taken." Stephanie nodded, her expression neutral. "I appreciate that, but this isn't just about me. It's about making sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else." The investigator's expression softened slightly. "We understand, and we're committed to addressing the broader issues here." When the meeting ended, Stephanie stepped out into the hallway, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. Justice was slow, and she knew that Wells might face little more than a slap on the wrist. But at least the wheels were in motion. At least the truth was out there. As she walked back to her office, Stephanie reflected on everything that had happened. Wells would face consequences, but it didn't end with him. This was part of a larger fight. A fight for fairness, for equality, for justice. And that fight didn't stop because one man had been held accountable. It was ongoing, relentless, and it demanded everything she had. But as she stepped into her office and sat down at her desk, Stephanie knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. She was stronger than this. Stronger than the prejudice, stronger than the doubt. And no one could take that from her. A few months had passed since the day Officer Wells had wrongfully arrested Stephanie, but the events still echoed in her mind. The public outcry over the incident had been swift and loud, especially when word got out that a seasoned FBI agent had been racially profiled and humiliated. The Bureau's internal affairs investigation had concluded, and Officer Wells had been suspended from the force. However, the consequences of his actions went beyond the legal realm. Stephanie sat at her desk, staring at the reports in front of her, but unable to focus. There was a sense of closure that had come with the investigation's outcome, but the emotional toll lingered. She had spent years proving herself, breaking barriers and fighting her way to the top, only to be brought low by a single moment of bias. She had been trained to handle pressure, to maintain her professionalism in the face of adversity, but this felt different. It had cut deeper. There was a knock at the door, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Marcus standing there, his expression unreadable. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Sure," Stephanie said, sitting back and folding her arms. "What's up?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "I wanted to talk to you about something. It's about Wells." Stephanie raised an eyebrow, her pulse quickening slightly at the mention of his name. She hadn't thought much about him since the investigation wrapped up. As far as she knew, he had been suspended, but she hadn't kept track of the details. "What about him?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. "I got a call from Internal Affairs this morning. They're thinking about giving him a second chance after some mandatory bias training, of course." Stephanie felt a jolt of surprise, mixed with a flash of anger. "A second chance? After everything that happened?" "I know," Marcus said quickly, holding up a hand to stop her. "I don't like it either, but you know how these things go. He's a decorated officer, and they're treating this like a learning opportunity for him." "A learning opportunity?" Stephanie repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "He nearly ruined an entire federal operation because of his biases, not to mention the personal damage he caused. And they think some training is going to fix that?" Marcus sighed again, his face full of sympathy. "I get it, Steph. Believe me, I do. But the system, it's flawed. People like Wells get away with things because they have a history of service, because they have friends in the right places. You know that as well as I do." Stephanie's hands balled into fists, resting on the desk in front of her. She had always known that the system was imperfect. She had experienced its flaws firsthand more times than she could count. But this felt like a slap in the face. Wells hadn't just made a mistake, he had made a choice to act on his prejudice, to assume the worst about her without even bothering to listen. And now he was being handed an easy way out. "They want me to meet with him," Marcus added quietly. Stephanie blinked. "Meet with him? Why?" "He requested it. He says he wants to apologize, to make things right." I think he's feeling the weight of everything that happened. The public backlash, the suspension, it's hit him hard. Stephanie was silent for a moment, processing this information. A part of her didn't care about Wells's feelings, about the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. But another part of her, the part that had always believed in justice, in fairness, knew that people could change. She had seen it before in the field when someone who had been lost in their own hatred or fear finally saw the light. But could Wells change? Was it even possible for someone like him to truly understand the damage he had done? "Do you think he's sincere?" she asked, her voice softer now. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know. But I think it might be worth hearing him out. If nothing else, it could give you some closure." Closure. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Stephanie had thought that seeing him suspended, knowing that he had faced consequences for his actions, would give her the closure she needed. But now, sitting there, she realized that she wasn't as at peace with the situation as she had hoped. She looked at Marcus, her mind spinning with possibilities. "When?" "Tomorrow." Marcus said, "Here at the office, it'll be private, no media, no spectacle, just you, me, and Wells." Stephanie sat back in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest. A part of her wanted to reject the idea outright, to refuse to give Wells the satisfaction of an apology. But another part of her, the part that had always believed in redemption, in the possibility of people learning from their mistakes, was curious. Maybe, just maybe, Wells had learned something from this. Maybe he had changed. And maybe, for her own sake, it was worth hearing what he had to say. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll be there." The next day, Stephanie found herself sitting in a small, private meeting room at the bureau, her heart beating steadily as she waited for Wells to arrive. Marcus sat beside her, offering quiet support. But neither of them spoke. There was an air of anticipation in the room, thick, with unresolved tension. The door opened, and Officer Jacob Wells stepped inside. He looked different from the man who had arrested her all those months ago. His shoulders were hunched slightly, his face pale and drawn. He seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had physically diminished him. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Wells hesitated at the door, his eyes flicking nervously between Stephanie and Marcus. He swallowed hard before stepping forward, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice unsteady, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Stephanie didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on him, studying his every movement. She wanted to believe that he was sincere, that this wasn't just some empty gesture to save face. But trust was hard to come by after what had happened. Wells took a deep breath and sat down across from her, his hands resting awkwardly on the table. I owe you an apology," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "For what I did, for the way I treated you." Stephanie remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. "I made assumptions about you," Wells said, his voice heavy with regret. "Assumptions that were wrong. I didn't listen to you. I didn't give you a chance. And because of that, I humiliated you. I endangered your mission. And I'm sorry." There was a long pause as the weight of his words settled between them. Stephanie felt a mix of emotion swirling inside her, anger, sadness, frustration, but also a small glimmer of something else. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the beginning of forgiveness, but it was too soon to say. "I'm not here to make excuses," Wells continued. "I know that what I did was wrong, and I know that no amount of training or apologies can undo the harm I caused. But I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, to doing better." Stephanie's eyes flicked to Marcus, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. She turned back to Wells, her voice calm but firm. "You hurt me," she said simply. "You disrespected me, not just as an agent, but as a person. You didn't see me. You saw what you wanted to see, and you let your biases control your actions. That's not something you can just apologize for and move on." Wells nodded, his eyes downcast. "I know. But," Stephanie continued, her voice softening slightly, "I believe people can change. I believe in second chances. I don't know if you've changed or if you will, but I'm willing to give you the chance to prove that you can." Wells looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. There was a sense of finality, of something shifting in the air. The meeting wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. A chance for Wells to reflect, to do better, and for Stephanie to find some semblance of closure. As Wells stood to leave, he hesitated at the door, turning back to look at Stephanie one last time. "I'll do better," he said softly. "I promise." When the door closed behind him, Marcus looked at Stephanie, his expression thoughtful. "How do you feel?" Stephanie sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I think I'm ready to move forward." Marcus smiled, nodding. "That's all that matters." As Stephanie left the meeting room, stepping out into the crisp autumn air, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The road to justice was long, and the fight against prejudice was far from over. But in that moment, she knew she had done what was right, not just for herself, but for the principle she had always stood for. That people could change, that redemption was possible, and that justice, no matter how delayed, was always worth pursuing. And in the end, that was all she needed. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.